or good morning, depending on where you're at. My name is Chris from Lehigh University, representative Division 17, supposed involved in this Advocacy Toolkit. I'm joined by my colleagues, Ivy Ho and Kenneth Matten, who will be helping along with the presentation today. A good number of the individuals that you see on the screen in front of you have been very much involved in this process for the past 10 months. We have been meeting twice a month, more about psychologists and advocates. We've met in Washington, D.C. to put together an initial framework for this presentation. And we're very happy to be with you all today to present it. This is my first time presenting on a webinar. I'm a real big fan of technology, actually, so you're going to have to bear with me as we walk through this. We have a lot planned for you all today, and we do want to just point you to the chat option. And this is where we're going to ask you to type down your questions for us. We are planning to leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end of this hour for some type of question and answer period. Just to summarize, just to start off with, the Advocacy Toolkit that you're going to be listening today was developed as a result of a joint effort between the four divisions that you see listed, 7, 35, and 45. And the goals were to create a science-based, high-quality advocacy toolkit that highlights different forms of advocacy strategies that we can use to inform policy at the local and state levels. We focused on local and state levels with a lot of intention to provide the types of relationships that we each may have at the local and state levels that privy to at the federal level. However, all that said, federal level advocacy is also very important. And in fact, psychologists have been very instrumental throughout our history in engaging in federal level, state level, and local level advocacy on issues that are very important to us. That address social injustice, rectify injustices in education and healthcare, and also in the availability of monies for food. So we understand that a good number of you, and right now there are about 36 of you on this, you have some experience already engaging in advocacy at the local and state levels, and we also recognize that there are some of you who are just itching to get into this type of activity. And so this talk is designed for a wide range of individuals, just the novice and not just for the person who's been involved for a long time in this type of work. What we do hope is that, that the Advocacy Toolkit is helpful and it will guide all of us in some of our efforts. Again, these are the four divisions that were involved, and I want to thank the four presidents of that division for having this idea of bringing us all together. So on this slide here, you'll see the model that this figure here represents what we've been thinking about for the steps for legislative advocacy at the local level. This is our attempt to depict this process. It looks linear, and it's not. So I just want to say that up front, that this is a model meant to help provide some structure to our thinking about the types of activities that we believe, based on our research, is necessary for some type of change to occur in legislation. What you'll see here also is that these steps can be grouped into two different processes. And here on this side here, you'll see focusing effort and also strategic analysis on the second half of the chart here. The first part, focusing effort, entails identifying issues, problems, issues of interest, Also addresses deciding on the advocacy target, the level of intervention, and also the type of involvement. And I'll go through each of these a little bit more in depth in a bit. We also have the second half here, the bottom half, strategic analysis. And these are the types of steps or strategies that are necessary for moving ideas to action. Now, all throughout this process, it's very important, we believe, for psychologists to be engaged in reflection of values. So it's important at the outset to clarify our values, understand what our limits are, what our lines are that we're not willing to cross. It's important to understand that people that we work with are also operating in a set of values, and we need to understand those as well. It's also important for psychologists to be engaged in self-care throughout the process, and to be mindful of ethical and multicultural considerations. These activities are important no matter where we are in the process of legislative advocacy. Now, I want to stay on this slide for a little while to go through components of it. Actually, I'll move to this slide. It looks a lot the same. It's got some questions on the side, questions we think are important for us to consider and to think about. I want to just focus on focusing effort right now. The first step of this process is to identify a clear and specific problem and an actionable issue. So what we're wanting for psychologists to think about is not just the big problems of the day, but the actual actionable issues, the thing that we can work on changing. So as an example, some psychologists will have either a clinical or a research interest in, let's say, poverty. And that's an important problem to address. Now, to drill down a little bit more, we may focus on something that we could be advocating. So something like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's an actionable issue. That's something that we can work toward strengthening and protecting for individuals who need it. Obviously, that's a federal level program, but that's just an example I wanted to pull out. When we identify a problem, we can really benefit ourselves if we spend some time researching the problem, the issues, and how they have been addressed by other individuals or other organizations interested in that same issue. What we're hoping and wanting is for psychologists to spend some time learning from other people's experience. So it's important for us as psychologists to be familiar with our psychological literature, our research, our theories, and to be able to communicate them in layperson terms. But it's also important to understand how other organizations have already engaged in this type of effort, so we don't replicate mistakes, and we're able to duplicate and build upon successes of past efforts. Once we've researched the problem and the issues and figured out how they've been engaged in the past, we should decide on the advocacy target. Now, the focus of today's talk is on legislative advocacy, but there are other targets for individuals to consider. And psychologists have been very successful and helpful in their judicial advocacy, writing amicus briefs, sitting as expert witnesses. We also have psychologists who've been engaged at the executive level and trying to influence change with those individuals in those positions of power. We're going to focus our attention at the legislative target today. And before I forget it, I want to say that there's that old, real, just great video, that Bill video. I wish I could remember the song, and I wish I could sing. so you can understand what I'm talking about. But that's that old School of Rock video, and that's an important video to reacquaint yourself with if you've forgotten it. It helps us to understand and remember the legislative process. The pieces that are missing in that video are the regulatory processes. I wanted to just spend just a second there to remind people that legislation, movement from a bill to a law, is very important. There are many different steps in that process, everything from generating the idea to writing the idea down into a bill and going into committee and having discussion and debate over the merits of that type of proposed legislation, all the way up to some type of chamber vote, whether it's in the House or the Senate and the Assembly, depending on how your state is set up. But after a bill becomes a law, the executive branch is charged with the responsibility of ensuring that that legislation is acted upon. And that's another piece of advocacy that can take place, and it's that regulatory piece. How is the piece of legislation being enforced? How are monies being distributed to support that piece of legislation as a whole discussion that we can have there. After you've decided on the advocacy target, and for the purposes of today, we're going to focus on the legislative, we can decide on the level. And here we've listed 3 levels, the federal level, the state level, and the local level. The federal and state level, the legislative, judicial, and executive branches parallel one another. So if you know anything about the federal level and how government works there, just apply the same basic principle to the state level, and you'll see the same branches, perhaps with some slightly different names, but the same types of processes are typically engaged in for a bill to become legislation and legislation to be enforced. So for this talk today, we're going to focus again on that state or local level. Once you've decided on that level, you need to decide on whether or not you want to work as an individual or as a group. We don't have any real strong, or at least I don't have any strong recommendations here. There are benefits to working as an individual, and there are also benefits to working as a group. Now, for the purposes of today, we're going to just give you a problem to consider, and we're going to use that problem as a way to frame the rest of the talk. So let's consider the sample problem of the school cultural climate. And maybe, let me back up here. Maybe the sample problem actually is academic achievement gaps and opportunity gaps facing students of color. And that's the big issue, the gaps. And the actual issue that we can work to change is the climate. And so the issue will be the cultural climate and the lack of diversity inclusion in the curriculum, in the books, in how adults treat students, in how peers relate to one another on any dimension of diversity, whether it's their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their gender, their race, ethnicity, or cultural background, or status of ability status. So we've got all those are different issues that we could address. So once we've identified the problem and the issue, we could research the problem and see how it's been done. I'm just going to give you my own personal example. This was something that I'm very much interested in, equity in schools. I work on it professionally, but I also do it pro bono in different communities and in my own community. And so I learned a little bit about how other people had addressed the issue and try not to replicate their mistakes. I initially decided to go out on my own and my pro bono work to do it on my own. And over time, individuals in the community started noticing that I was attending meetings and showing up at school board meetings and meeting with the superintendent on my own, calling and pushing the issue of inclusion. And so over time, they developed trust in me, and because they didn't know who I was, these were other parents in the community, and they decided to flag me down after one of the meetings. And together we decided to work on forming a group so that we can work on disseminating information and sharing in each other's successes and supporting one another through our monthly meetings. So I decided to work on that local legislative and executive target, and met with the school board members, met with the superintendents, met with other key stakeholders. I actually decided that my area of interest, or the issue that I was going to target, was on social and emotional learning within a multicultural context. And that'll become a little bit more clear later on as I explain why I did that. The second portion of this is the strategic analysis. And here you have some important steps. The first is developing long and short-term SMART goals. So with the example of the school-based diversity inclusion issue, I worked with my colleagues on developing both long and short-term goals. And some of those short-term goals were focused on learning more about the mental health program at this one particular district. We were going to learn more about how the school counseling program was being implemented, how it's being delivered, and whether or not school counselors were being used in the way that they could be, providing support for social emotional learning, for working on diversity and inclusion issues in their buildings. We wanted to learn a little bit more about what was going on. Some of our midterm and long-term goals were to address more inclusion of diverse books in the library and also in the curriculum. And so we had some individuals who were very keen on that. And so we capitalized on individual strengths as opposed to focusing on just deficits of the school district. We focused on our strengths and leveraged our strengths in the best way that we could. We also had short-term goals of getting the school district to participate in a consortium on equity and excellence, so that the school building leaders could become more educated about equity and inclusion issues and how they were very much tied to academic excellence. So we had these goals, and these goals were important for us because every time we hit one of these goals or we met one of these goals, there were a moment. It was a moment for us to celebrate, and those celebrations are really important to sustain the energy of any type of advocacy effort. We saw that this was going to be a long-term effort, and there were several of us that just wanted to make sure that we addressed joy, and we made sure that we could experience some in this process. Some of the other midterm and long-term goals are really focused on leadership of the group and whether or not we had individuals who could follow the initial group of leaders. Because speaking for myself, it's not something that I envision being able to do on a long-term basis. The next step here is identifying stakeholders and allies and opponents. This is pretty straightforward, and you want to be able to identify the different people who could be who this type of new policy or could affect. So parents, families, community members, business owners are all people who are critical stakeholders. Law enforcement, and actually, when we delivered this talk in San Francisco at the American Psychological Association, one of the union workers who was helping us with sound and video came up to me and afterwards and said, "Don't forget your unions. Don't forget that we could be really good, important, stakeholders that can turn into allies. Make sure you tell other psychologists that we're here and that we can be really instrumental in equity and inclusion work." So that's not on this slide, but I do remember his suggestion to me. But these are some of the other people who could be very important stakeholders: allied health professionals, business community, law enforcement, faith-based leaders are very important. Individuals who work for not-for-profits. As an example, I've connected with people who run peace centers and in and around the area. Other people who focus on dialogue, and even though they don't come weekly or monthly to our meetings, where I'm able to benefit from their energy. It's also important to identify allies. These are individuals, who are going to just support you, and they have a high level of agreement on the topics, and they're going to help you with not just tasks, but filling you with the right type of energy and spirit that you need to continue work. Now, not all allies are going to share all of your values and all of your ideas. And so it's important to be able to have these open and honest conversations about what each person's or each group's respective values are. I think the more you're able to be clear on that, the less tension and confusion and conflict there'll be later on. It's also obviously very important to identify opponents. There are some opponents that are very obvious, people who've made comments in the past or who campaigned very openly and maybe even in mean-spirited ways against the types of topics or issues that you're interested in. Those are, your obvious opponents, and then there are some opponents that are not so obvious. And what I want to just emphasize here is that even the individuals who you believe are your opponents can actually turn into an ally if we spend the time, if they're open, and if we spend the time to dispel and explain our effort. At the very least, these opponents may not stand in our way. These individuals, are probably more common than we think. And these are individuals who, maybe are misinformed, maybe, are thinking that we are trying to take away rights from other groups. And if we're able to explain to them what our efforts are, some of them may just, support us or just steer clear of us. Now, some of these individuals, some of these opponents are just not going to change their ideas or their approach to opposing us or your idea. And so it's important to be able to research your opponents, understand what types of approaches they typically take, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, what their strategies are, so that we can anticipate, so that you can anticipate what it is that they'll do. And also, importantly for your group, when we do hit roadblocks, when your advocacy effort hits roadblocks, to be able to label and identify what it is that's going on. When we're able to label what's going on, we can have a better understanding of it. We can lessen our frustration and regroup and develop a strategy the next time it happens that we're in contact with that individual. I think when it comes to working with opponents and having conversations with them, as psychologists, we are uniquely qualified. We understand our biases. We have our science behind us. We have our research. And so we should use those strengths, be data-driven, provide the evidence there. And also, we should be sure to pay attention to our relational orientation. Now, some of us are more relationally oriented than others, granted, but we all are trained, or many of us are trained, to be good listeners and to be good, effective communicators, and we need to be able to capitalize on that. One of the other steps, and this is identifying decision makers in committees, this link here allows you to identify who your state elected officials are, and you can just type in your zip code and it'll pop up. Now, one of the things that I find is helpful when I work with community members is to not assume that they know. And so this is a slide that I show to individuals, and I encourage them to find their legislator. Now, it's also important when we identify decision makers to identify relevant committees. And so these individuals here are all representatives, but they sit on different committees, and every single state has many different committees, and those can all be points of action and advocacy. So I want to just stop there and turn the it's not a floor, I guess. Turn the whatever over to Dr. Madden, and I apologize for taking to go over my time. Ken?
Yes, thanks so much, Chris. That was great and worth all the time that you took. And thanks for the personal example, which I think is really, really helpful. So our toolkit that we have a draft composed contains seven different methods for influencing policy. And I'm just going to take a little time today to give you a little teaser of what's included about each of the 7 methods in the toolkit. And I'll have a little time to go into some more detail on a few of the methods, but basically mostly will be an overview. In the toolkit, for each method, we have the different types of activities that's related to that method. Let me actually go ahead and get the slideshow going there. Okay, so for each of the 7 methods in the toolkit, we have different activities that are different varieties of that method, and we include links in the toolkit so you can get additional information, sometimes how-to information, additional resources for each activity. In the toolkit, we provide examples of psychologists who have successfully used that activity. We also have, for each method, how to get involved in that method. Each method can be differentiated by its pathway. Chris already talked about the 2 types of pathways: direct, where you directly contact and work with policymakers or decision makers, and indirect, where you might work with a professional organization or an advocacy group, and they directly influence the policymaker or decision maker, but you are influencing the influencer. The target Chris mentioned could be legislative, it could be executive branch officials, who are very important for most of our specialty areas. It could be the judicial branch, and it also could be local organizations, like in Chris's example, the local school system. and at different levels of government. National, state, which we're focusing more on the toolkit on state and local, county and city. And finally, there are different mechanisms of influence that differentiate the pathways, the methods, excuse me. Some of the mechanisms are more we're used to, like education and guidance, providing information, providing ideas, and some we might not initially have much experience with, but they're very important. And that includes providing pressure, which is more an external influence. So we have education, guidance, persuasion, we might not be as used to, and pressure as well. So in the toolkit, again, this just being a teaser for it, you will find all this information about each of the 7 methods. So the first method I'm going to go over today is direct communication, involves face-to-face meetings, seminars, hearings, briefings, conferences. And I don't have time to go into all of those, but I'll tell you a little bit about face-to-face meetings today. All of the 5 of those, though, are examples of the direct pathway where you're directly interfacing with a decision maker. And that could be particularly useful and has been useful for psychologists working with the legislative branch, the executive branch, and as Chris just shared, working with a local school or school system. And the mechanism of influence, persuasion, and education in most of these meetings that we hold. So to say a little more about it, the meetings that you have in terms of face-to-face meetings, focusing here, they can be set up by the psychologist, by a policymaker or decision maker inviting you because they know of your reputation, or by a third party group, such as an advocacy organization or a professional association. Face-to-face meetings are especially appropriate at local levels, where the policymaker may be within your community, and thus provide the opportunity for developing longer-term relationships, which are really important for some of the other methods I'll talk about. Depending on the goals and nature of the meeting, the psychologist could apply one or more of those mechanisms of influence. Could be mostly education or could include persuasion as well, depending. So examples of the use of face-to-face meetings at the local level, building on Chris's example, could include arranging a meeting with the school superintendent to discuss racial discrimination, lack of inclusion in the district's schools, and presenting a research-based case for policy change. In this example, the psychologist may present the current policy, practice, and the impact of racially hostile climates, for example, on students. They may make recommendations on as to how a policy might be changed to prevent and remediate such occurrences using psychological research, for example, regarding microaggressions, systemic racism, and behavior change. How to get involved? Well, direct meetings with the legislature or their staff, for example, are a great opportunity to directly convey messages. And in the toolkit, we include a link to a website that will allow you to access contact information, as Chris just shared, for your elected representatives at various levels of government. When meeting with any elected official or their staff, or any decision maker, it is generally a good idea to come prepared with specific talking points about the issue you are trying to advocate for. In the toolkit, we provide a link so you can find more guidance on preparing for a direct meeting. We also provide links that provide guidance for calling, emailing, or writing your elected or local officials. So another policy influence method that you could choose to use, depending on all the strategic work up front that Chris shared with you, could be policy advocacy groups, which include boards, commissions, committees, councils, and task forces. At the state or local level, these groups may be created within the local government, within schools, with Chris's example, or in other public service entities. Engaging in advocacy through commissions and task forces generally involves identifying the decision or policy group that you're going to target, as Chris talked about, reviewing current policy, considering potential alterations based on research or practice expertise, and providing actionable suggestions for change. The resulting product might be a policy report or a white paper, which we'll get to later. To go on a few examples that are included in the toolkit, psychologist Alan Ratcliffe has served on multiple advocacy groups over the years in Tacoma, Washington, including the City Human Services Commission, the County Mental Health Advisory Board, and the Tacoma Landmarks Preservation Commission. His policy contributions sometimes resulted from his former role as director of the Community Health Center in Tacoma, but also when he retired from that position, they resulted just as a volunteer and a citizen. Research psychologist Dr. Beth Shin, to give a second example that we highlight in the toolkit, offered to share her research on homelessness with New York City officials over a number of administrations without success, until her persistence finally paid off. And she received an invitation to serve on a Department of Homeless Services research advisory group, which she then contributed to for many years. And references to those examples are included in the toolkit. In terms of getting involved, as these examples illustrate, one way to get involved in commissions or task forces is to come to the attention of policymakers through your work position or research. Alternatively, reaching out to policymakers or volunteering one's time and knowledge, an important thing that a number of people, psychologists do, may allow you to be identified by psychologists, by policymakers or decision makers as someone with interest and expertise for a potential commission or task force. Yet another opportunity for providing feedback during the policy making process is by writing public comments on regulations as part of the rulemaking process, a stable part of the executive branch of government. And this is at all levels. And again, we provide additional information in the toolkit through several links about how to get further information about these. Okay, I'm going to just quickly go through this next one, given limited time. Consultative roles is a third area. You can develop an ongoing consultative relationship with the local school superintendent, the local principal, local head of special ed, the local, many different local officials, decision makers, or you can provide technical assistance. You might have a specific area of expertise, whether it's developing curriculum on inclusion or evaluating local programming or state programming or curriculum. An example of someone from our task force is Dr. Kira Banks, who has an ongoing consultative relationship, and that was with the Ferguson Commission for Equity and Inclusion that followed the fatal shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. So the pathways can be direct or indirect. You can consult directly with a policymaker in the examples I gave you, but it's indirect as well. You can consult with an advocacy group or professional organization, which will then directly share the information with policymakers. Again, it can target multiple branches of government, local organizations, and that role is primarily guidance. Okay, another one I'm going to go through really quickly. Actually, I'll spend a little more time on this one, is documents and products. So these include policy reports, policy and research briefs, fact sheets, publications, or tools that are practical guides for implementation. And this can involve a direct pathway where you directly are sharing, let's say, your policy report with a policy group, or an indirect pathway where you might be sharing with an advocacy or professional organization, a research brief, a fact sheet, or maybe even a publication. Your target can be multiple branches of government or local organizations. And here, again, we're in doing education, but we also can be involved in persuasion. So to take the example of policy reports, they often are the results of an advisory group, as I described earlier, or they may be commissioned separately by a government body or an intermediary organization. These reports generally summarize existing policy and research and provide suggestions for policy changes. They can address social justice concerns by potentially highlighting problems with existing policy or suggesting policy that might address a social concern. How might you get involved? Similar to other involvements, psychologists are often invited by relevant officials. If you're known for your expertise or your research findings in the preparation of a report. But importantly, psychologists can also bring themselves or their work to the attention of policymakers or to an intermediary organization in your area of expertise and influence. And there's pretty much advocacy groups for every area of expertise and interest that you might have, and as well, professional associations can guide you towards appropriate groups to work with. I just mentioned briefly, whereas policy reports can be longer, policy and research briefs are 1 to 2 page documents that summarize very briefly, often using bullets and visuals, pertinent knowledge and viewpoints that can be easily disseminated and understood by policymakers, other decision makers, and their staff. And we provide links in the toolkit to how to prepare, tips for how to prepare effective short policy and research briefs or fact sheets. Okay, so I know my time is getting a little bit short, so I'm going to not cover media. Media, though, does include news coverage, op-eds, letters to the editors. We have really good links in the toolkit for how to provide brief op-eds or letters to the editor in local, state newspapers or national, media interviews, news conference, of course, critically social media, and websites, which are very important. Media is important indirectly. It's a way to indirectly influence the public who influence policymakers, and it also could influence policymakers through advocacy organizations and professional organizations, and sometimes they may actually directly look at your media. The target can be all the branches of government as well as local organizations. And here the mechanism of influence really can vary depending on exactly the strategy you're involved with. It could be education, persuasion, or pressure. The other example that I'll spend a little more time on is external advocacy. Is pretty different than some of the earlier ones. Here you might do work on a campaign to mobilize constituents, and the constituents could be fellow psychologists, depending on the issue, community organizing, larger social movements. And we have an example in the toolkit of Dr. Paul Spear. I think I have a moment to cover some of this information here. So external advocacy usually involves working with advocacy or professional organizations. The psychologists may help the advocacy or professional organization raise public awareness about an issue or a piece of legislation, share research findings, prepare organization-sponsored reports, or serve on organizational advisory groups. External advocacy may also require networking, coalition building in the community, use of media, petitions, rallies, and protests, or supporting professional community organizers, in which trained organizers mobilize citizens who in turn take actions to pressure officials to respond. The toolkit provides a link to the Community Toolbox, a site that provides helpful resources for how to conduct external advocacy effectively. As an example, Dr. Paul Spear was approached by a community organizing group, PICO, to provide compelling evidence to support their campaign to pressure the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, to invest funding in rehabilitating abandoned housing. Spear and his graduate students provided vivid geographic information systems maps that clearly linked abandoned housing in Camden to high levels of neighborhood crime. PICO effectively used the GIS maps through media and public actions to force the mayor's turnabout on the issue. And like our other examples, we have references in the toolkit so you can read more about that. How to get involved. Relationships between psychologists and advocacy organizations may be initiated by the organization, for example, when knowledgeable individuals are sought concerning the issues at hand, as in Paul Spear's case. But psychologists can also initiate contact to help ensure that their knowledge, expertise, ideas, and connections are put to use in the policy arena. Okay, I'm going to wind up really quickly here. I'm not going to go over the courtroom, but except to say that amicus briefs, court testimony, and expert reports have been really important arenas in which psychologists have influenced policy. We have some really good examples in the toolkit of that. The pathway is direct, the target's the judicial branch, and here the mechanism of influence is persuasion. Okay, so again, this is just a teaser. I went through it really quickly, and I'm going to hand over to Ivy to finish up with covering a number of different areas of the toolkit that kind of round out Chris's and mine presentations.
Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Ivy Ho, and I represent Division 35. So ethical considerations. Definitely as psychologists, we always want to conduct ourselves in ethical ways. The toolkit does go into a discussion of ethical considerations. And today I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So one example is multiple relationships. This would pertain to psychologists in certain fields. So for example, if you had a patient or a client who also is advocating for the same cause within the same organization, there might be some potential issues with multiple relationships there. And so it's helpful to have that conversation early in the therapeutic relationship if that should arise. Another ethical consideration will be respect for differing views, especially if you have students or colleagues, clients, patients who may have a different view from you. Again, this is another ethical consideration in terms of how we interact with these other individuals and being respectful of their viewpoints. And finally, you know, advocacy can be a very public kind of activity, and we want to be very mindful of any potential conflict of interest, whether we're advocating as a psychologist or as a private citizen. And finally, in closing, I know something that's very common among psychologists is we have the imposter syndrome. And so as part of our toolkit, we try to make sure that we talk about ways to enhance our self-efficacy. And the thing is, you know, without knowing it, you already have the advocacy skills, regardless of how much experience you have in this particular activity. So throughout our training, throughout our careers, we've been building relationship building skills, whether it's building a relationship with your graduate school advisor, building a relationship with negotiating your first professional position, talking to strangers at a conference. You know, we've been developing these relationship building skills already that we can really bring to bear in our advocacy work. We've also been really building our communication skills. You know, a lot of us are teachers, and even if you weren't formally a teacher, even if you aren't formally a teacher, we're constantly teaching people in different ways. You could be at a family gathering and explaining to a lay person, a relative, what you do at work, to teaching in the classroom, to, you know, explaining your research to a new person you just met at a conference. These are all things that help us build our communication skills. And of course, with advocacy, that's really important, being able to convey our research findings, being able to convey our areas of expertise in non-jargon types of language. These are skills that we want to continue to develop and improve upon. And finally, you know, we already have a lot of strategic analysis and research skills that we've been building throughout our training and our careers. So I like to think of advocacy really as a series of steps in the scientific method. So when you go online, go to the websites that, you know, Chris had mentioned earlier, and you're looking at the legislator's record, that's essentially you're doing a literature review to look at reviewing the legislator's record. And from there, maybe you formulate a hypothesis that this particular legislator would be somebody who would be amenable to your cause. From there, you reach out to the legislator, you talk to them, and, you know, try and persuade them to support your cause and see how they react. And that's basically, you know, data collection and hypothesis testing. And based on your interpretation of the data, your interpretation of how the meeting went, you then think about where the next step should be, which is, you know, developing your future directions. And so a lot of the things we do are already akin to the different steps of advocacy work. And so with that, go out there and start doing it. The time is now, given everything that's happening in this country, in the world. There's really no reason to hold back if there are issues that you really feel strongly about and you want to bring to bear your psychological expertise. And you get to choose where and how to begin. Ken just went through a series of different ways that advocacy work can happen, and you get to choose how you want to do it. And the trouble is, the other side can do magic too. This is a quote from Harry Potter, when the Muggle Prime Minister said to the wizards, if you're trying to defeat Lord Voldemort, why don't you just use magic? You can use magic. That shouldn't be a problem. And the wizard said to him, but the other side can do magic too. What that means is, if we do not advocate for what we believe in, somebody who's on the other side of the issue definitely would be. And so it's up to us to give voice to the issues that we care about. And with that, I'm going to conclude the prepared part that we have and open up to questions. Okay. If folks have questions, you can either type them in the Q&A box or in the chat box.
There is one question now. And so there are two questions, actually. We'll take the first one from Mickey Burns. And we hadn't talked about making the slides available, but I suppose we could. I don't imagine anyone in the group would be opposed to it. So we'll just have to get together, Mickey, to figure out how to best get that out to everyone.
And there's a question on the chat about when and where will the toolkit be available, from Suzanne Phillips. And I think, emailed out to all registrants a draft of the toolkit. We will be collecting feedback. We already have some feedback, but we would love feedback from you all who have relevant examples that we could share, particularly links to how to do things or useful background information, and any other thoughts or ideas you have about how to make the toolkit more useful and more accessible to people with varying levels of experience. So the final version, I think we hope to have ready to go in January or February, I believe. So where you have a draft, though, and if you didn't receive a draft, you can email probably the SCP webinars link that you have, and then you'll be able to get a draft copy, which will have the links and reference on. We just ask that you don't share it. It is in draft form, and what we hope to get, and the reason we're really doing the webinars in part, is to get additional material that we can include and additional ideas for it. But if you didn't get it when you register, just send one of us or the SCP webinars email. We'll get you a draft version.
And actually, Ivy just posted the Google form for you all to complete. The Google form is a quick feedback tool for us to use for the toolkit itself, not for the presentation of the toolkit, as Ken was saying earlier. We want to make this toolkit useful for everyone, and so any thoughts you have regarding the toolkit, please share with us on the Google form. And Suzanne, we'll try to get you the toolkit to you. If you email Dr. Pensy, she'll be able to get you a copy, or you can email either one of us, anyone else.
Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Well, I guess if there are no other comments
Yeah.
or questions,
So if folks want to take a look at the chat box, you can see the email to send emails to for any copies of the toolkit to Dr. Pansy.
And I also just noticed that someone used the chat function to just give their email address and ask for a copy of the toolkit. So that's another way to do it, is to just put in the chat box your email address and that you'd like a copy if you didn't get one yet.
okay. Well, then thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.